Here's how I would explain the existence of God in 5 levels of difficulty, starting with a young child. Let's begin by noticing something. Whenever you do anything, you can always point to a reason why you're doing it. Let's say that right now you are climbing a tree. You're probably doing that because you think it'll be fun to climb the tree, and you like having fun. Now let's say you're at the grocery store with your mom and dad. You're probably doing that because your parents told you to, and you don't want to get in trouble. Or maybe because you're hoping that by obeying them, you can convince them to give you some kind of treat, like ice cream. There's always a reason behind what you're doing. And this isn't just true for you, or for me, or for people. It's true for things, too. There's always a reason why things do what they do, even if they don't think about what they're doing like we do. Trees, for example, grow big roots to reach water deep in the ground. That's the reason why they grow roots. Squirrels bury acorns so that they'll have food in the winter. That's why squirrels bury acorns. The moon goes around the Earth because of the force of gravity. That's why the moon goes around the Earth. There's always an explanation, a reason why for things being the way they are. But there's one thing that doesn't seem to have an obvious explanation for why it is the way it is, and that's the existence of the whole world, the fact that the world as a whole, or the universe as a whole, exists, and of everything in the world, why everything in the world exists. After all, nothing in the universe has to be the way it is. Nothing. Take something simple, like a pencil. This pencil doesn't have to exist. It could be snapped in half. It could be turned into pencil shavings by a pencil sharpener. Or it could even be thrown in a fire and burnt up dramatically. Everything in the world around us is like this. Everything we see, from the small things like pencils to the big things like planets and whole galaxies, might not exist if certain things happen to it. So this makes us wonder, why does any of it exist at all? After all, like we said a second ago, everything has a reason for why it is the way it is. The only good answer to this question, the only good answer to the question of why pencils or the world as a whole and everything in the universe exists, is that they must have been made by something which isn't like anything in the world around us. Something which, unlike this pencil or planets or galaxies, is so great that nothing could possibly destroy it. So it couldn't possibly be any way other than it is right now. Something like this wouldn't need anything outside itself to make it exist. So we wouldn't need to look for a reason outside of it to figure out why it exists, like we need to with other things. This gives us a final answer to why anything exists at all. Things exist because this one thing, this one being, which has to exist by its very what it is, its very nature, we might say, made them. And this thing which has to exist and makes everything that doesn't have to exist is what people mean when they talk about God. Now let's look at this a different way. What we're really asking here is the question, why does something exist rather than nothing? It definitely seems like there could have been nothing, but instead, there's something. Why is this? I think there's 3 possible answers to this question. The first possible answer is to say that there's actually no answer at all. But this is really, really unsatisfying. And also, it risks undermining all of science, because science is based on the idea that things have reasons for being the way they are. So if you say that there's something that can be the way it is without a reason, then you undermine science. So option 1 is off the table. The second possible answer is to say that there is a reason for why the things around us exist, and that reason is somehow found in the natures, the isness of those things themselves. So, for example, the reason why this pencil exists would be found in the pencil itself. There's something about this pencil that explains why it exists. But this can't be true, because in order for a thing to be a reason for its own existence, it would have to be the kind of thing that can't not exist. To use a technical term, it would have to be necessary. But nothing in this world can be necessary, since everything in this world is capable of not existing, of being destroyed. So this doesn't work either. This leaves us with a third option, which is that the things we see around us are caused to exist by something outside of themselves. This is a good answer at first, but it ultimately still leaves us with a major question that has to be answered. If the reason for one thing's existence is that it is caused to exist by some other thing, well, we'd still have to ask what's causing that other thing, that second thing. So, for example, if this pencil is caused by the pencil factory, well, that explains where the pencil came from, but doesn't explain where the pencil factory came from. To use an analogy, it's kind of like if you looked at a single boxcar of a train and asked what was causing it to move. You might want to say, well, the car in front of it is causing it to move, of course. But then you have to ask what's moving that car. And if it's another car, then you have to ask what's moving that one too. Eventually, the only way you get out of this is if you say that there's some car which is being moved not by another car, but because it has the power to move itself. In other words, a train engine. By the same token, if you want to get a satisfying answer to the question of why anything we see around us exists, you ultimately have to conclude that there's at least one being which is not caused to exist by something else, but which has its reason for its existence in its own nature. But as we said earlier, only a necessary being could be its own reason for its existence. And since nothing in this material world is necessary, we must conclude that there is a necessary being outside of the material world, which is the ultimate cause for the existence of everything else. And this thing is what we mean when we talk about God. The force behind this argument becomes clearer if you introduce some technical language here and compare the concept of necessary existence to the other kind of existence a thing can have, contingent existence. A thing is necessary if it can't not be. A thing is contingent if it could be otherwise. This might sound a little abstract, but we're actually very familiar with this contingent necessary distinction from daily life. For example, a triangle is three-sided of necessity. If a shape isn't three-sided, it's not a triangle. You can't have a triangle that's not three-sided, obviously. But the color of any particular triangle is contingent. This particular triangle is purple, but it doesn't have to be purple to be a triangle. I could use a red marker to make it a red triangle, and it would still be just as much a triangle as before. Or, to take another example, a human being is alive of necessity. When a human being dies, it's not a human being anymore, it's a corpse. But a human being has any number of a whole lot of features that are contingent. I'm 5'10", but I would still be human if I was 5'3". I have blue eyes, but there are people who have brown eyes, and they're just as human. There are some features that we human beings have necessarily, and other features that we have contingently. We're very familiar with this contingent necessity distinction from every day. But where this gets interesting is when we apply this necessary versus contingent distinction to the existence of things. Is there anything that exists of necessity? Well, there's one thing we can say for sure, and that's that nothing we see around us exists of necessity. We know by experience that this is true of the stuff in our immediate surroundings, but we can also show philosophically that it must be true of everything in the material world. We can do this by looking at the notion of matter. By definition, matter is extended in space. You can't have anything that's made up of matter that's not extended in space. But anything that's extended in space can be broken up conceptually into smaller parts. Because my hand extends across space, we can talk about the right side of my hand and the left side of my hand, or the back and the front side of my hand. Because of the extended nature of matter, anything which is made up of matter can be broken down into smaller parts. But to break something down into smaller parts is to destroy that thing. Therefore, whatever is made up of matter can in theory be destroyed. That means that it's impossible for anything which is made up of matter to exist of necessity, since by definition, only something which can't be destroyed, even in theory, exists of necessity. So if something could be destroyed, even in theory, without actually ever being destroyed, which anything of matter is in that condition, anything that's made up of matter could be destroyed in theory, it's not necessary. So everything in the physical material world is contingent. Does this mean that everything that exists contingently? We might be tempted to conclude that, but there's a major problem with saying that everything exists contingently. The biggest problem is that it violates what's known as the principle of sufficient reason, which says that everything has a reason for being the way it is. And we really don't want to violate the principle of sufficient reason, because this principle is what allows us to know that whenever we observe something, there's a reason why that something is the way it is, which forms the basis for all of science, all of history, all of sociology, and honestly most other fields of learning. So if we throw out the principle of sufficient reason, we'd throw out most of our knowledge. We'd basically throw out the idea that we can even know things about the world. But the thing is, if we say that everything that exists contingently and nothing exists of necessity, then we'd be throwing out the principle of sufficient reason, because we'd be saying that ultimately there's no reason, there's no ultimate reason why anything exists at all. Because if thing A exists contingently, then thing A is dependent on something else for its existence. We'll call that thing B. But if thing B exists contingently, then it must be dependent on a third thing for its existence, thing C. But if that third thing C, itself exists contingently, then there must be a thing D responsible for its existence. In theory, this would have to go back to infinity if everything existed contingently, since nothing would exist by its own nature. But that would be like saying that a chandelier is held up by an infinitely long chain that never actually attaches to a ceiling. No matter how long the chain is, if it's not attached to something that has the power to hold the chandelier up, like a ceiling, the chandelier will be on the ground. Because none of those links in the chain have the power on their own to hold the chandelier up. In the same way, unless we can concede that there is a being which has existence of necessity and not derived from another, then we have no explanation for how anything exists at all. Therefore, there must exist a being which has existence of its own nature, a being which exists outside of the contingently existing material worlds, and gives everything in it existence, and this gives us the start of the classical notion of God. Let's beef up this argument a bit by introducing a philosophic distinction from the Middle Ages. Starting in the 13th century, medieval philosophers began making a distinction between a thing's essence and its existence. Put simply, an essence is what a thing is, and its existence is the fact that the thing is. We know that there must be this distinction, the medievals argued, because we can know what a thing is without automatically knowing that it is. For example, let's say you had gone your whole life knowing nothing at all about animals, and I went up to you and told you about 3 different kinds of animals: dogs, dinosaurs, and unicorns. I could perfectly describe these 3 kinds of animals to you, and you would still have no idea which of these animals actually existed. You would be able to identify these animals on the street. If I showed you a picture of a dog, you could say that's a dog. If I showed you a picture of a T-Rex, you could say that's a T-Rex. If I showed you a picture of a unicorn, you could say that's a unicorn. You would have a complete knowledge of the essences of these things, of what these things are, but you wouldn't actually know whether or not they exist. You wouldn't know, for example, that a dog is an animal that exists right now, a T-Rex is an animal that used to exist but doesn't anymore, and a unicorn is an animal that has never existed except in fairy tales. You can know the essence of animals without grasping their existence. This shows that there really is this distinction between a thing's essence and its existence. Now, it's on this distinction between essence and existence that medieval philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas base the notion of necessity and contingency. For the medievals, a thing is contingent if its existence is different from its essence, and it's necessary if its existence is the same as its essence. And this just makes sense, because if a thing's essence is existence, it can't ever possibly not exist, so it must be necessary. Because in order for it not to exist, you'd have to separate its essence from its existence. But if its essence is existence, you can't do that. But if its essence is not existence, then you can do that. And that essence, that existence could always in theory be taken away from it, so it's contingent. This notion of a necessary being as a being whose essence just is its existence allowed the medievals to say a few things about what such a being must be like. They could say, for example, that such a being must not lack any existence, since its nature, its essence, just is existence, and you can't lack what's in your own nature. But from this, it follows that there could only ever be one such being, since the only way to distinguish 2 beings of the same kind is by pointing to some feature, some quality, some kind of existence that one of them has that the other one doesn't. And this being can't lack any kind of existence. So you can't actually have 2 beings whose essence is their existence, 2 necessary beings. They could also say that this thing must be unable to change, since the ability to change requires the ability to gain or lose some kind of existence. And again, this thing can't lose or gain any kind of existence, since by its very definition, it has all existence perfectly. This means that a necessary being, if it exists, must be immaterial, since matter is intrinsically changeable. It also must be timeless, since time measures change, and not composed of any component parts, since anything which is made up of parts can, in theory, be broken down into those parts. So if there is a necessary being, a being whose essence is existence, it is a singular, immaterial, unchanging, timeless, perfectly simple being. But does any such being exist? I mean, obviously, nothing we see around us could be such a being, since everything around us is made up of matter, and made up of parts and changeable and not singular. There's multiple kinds of things around us. And this being needs to be immaterial and outside of time and singular and changeless. So if there is such a necessary being, we can't discover it through sense observation, because everything around us we can discover through sense observation. But this doesn't rule out us being able to discover it through logic and philosophy. All we need to do is find some effect in the world that can only be attributed to a being whose essence is its existence as a possible cause, a kind of effect that only such a being could cause. But what could such an effect be? Well, here's one suggestion. Existence. The existence of everything in the world. Let's think about this for a second. If there was no being whose essence is existence, then everything which exists would have a distinction between its essence and its existence. That means that everything which exists would have to get its existence from something else, since nothing would have existence intrinsically, or by its own nature. But this creates a problem. If one thing is given existence by another thing, which is given existence by another thing, which is given existence by another thing, we still have to ask where any of these things are getting this existence thing from in the first place. None of these things have existence by their own natures. So where are they getting this power to give existence to another thing from? The only way out of this problem is to say that there exists a being whose essence is existence. And as we said earlier, such a being must be necessary, singular, immaterial, unchanging, timeless, and perfectly simple. And now we can add that as the thing responsible for giving existence to everything else which exists, this thing must be the creator of all that is. In other words, it must be God. All right, it's time to put this argument more formulaically. Premise 1, things exist. I don't think most people are going to disagree with this one. I mean, I suppose there are some radical skeptics who might, but I think that radical skepticism is ultimately incoherent. Check out the video in the description if you want more on that. Premise 2. There is a real distinction in things between their essence and existence. A real distinction is one which is discovered, not invented, by the mind. In other words, it's a distinction between two really different things or principles, not just between concepts or words used to describe things. Saying that there's a real distinction between essence and existence, then, means that essence and existence are two distinct principles within a thing. This premise is more controversial than the last one, so let me offer 3 arguments in favor of it. First, and most intuitively, there must be this distinction, as one can understand the essence of a thing without thereby grasping its existence. I can know, for example, what a unicorn is while remaining oblivious to the fact that unicorns don't actually exist. The essence of a unicorn does not entail existence. Therefore, there's a real distinction between the essences of things and the property of existence. Second, we need a real distinction to explain the observed operations of the human mind. When we know, we claim to know the essences or natures of things. If this wasn't the case, if we couldn't actually know the essences or natures of things, then our ability to have knowledge about the world would be compromised. But if when we know the essences or natures of things, then it means that the same essence must exist both in our minds and in the thing known. For example, if I know what a dog is, then that means that the essence of a dog exists both in my mind and in real dogs out in the world. In other words, a single essence exists in multiple ways. This shows that an essence is not tied down to a single kind of existence, and that essence and existence must therefore be distinct principles. Third, we can run a reduction to absurdity argument to show that if there was no distinction between essence and existence, it would entail a collapse into a Parmenidean system. If essence was the same as existence, then there would be no way to distinguish one essence from another, since the only way to distinguish two things is by pointing to something that one of them has that the other one doesn't. And if everything's essence was existence, then nothing could lack existence. This would mean that everything is really just the same thing, which is clearly absurd. Therefore, if we want to avoid ending up with a system like that proposed by the Greek philosopher Parmenides, who said that everything was just the same being and that change was impossible, we should accept the real distinction between essence and existence. So, there's a real distinction between essence and existence. On to premise 3. Premise 3. Whatever has a distinction between its essence and existence must receive existence from something else. The reason for this is straightforward. If something has existence, it must have a reason for its existence. This reason for its existence can either be found in the thing itself or in something outside that thing. If the thing's existence is distinct from its essence, that reason cannot be found in the thing itself by definition, since to have your reason for your existence of your own nature is the same thing as to have existence be included in your nature or essence. Therefore, everything in which essence and existence are distinct must have a reason for its existence in something outside itself, i.e., it must receive existence from another thing. Premise 4. If the thing which gives existence to another thing itself has a distinction between its essence and existence, it must receive existence from something else. I'm putting this as a separate premise, but it really is just the same principle from premise 3 restated to make a point. If thing A is given existence by thing B, and if thing B is itself the kind of thing which must be given existence by another, then there must be a thing C giving existence to both thing B directly and to thing A indirectly. Premise 5. Such a sequence cannot go back to infinity. So thing A receives existence from thing B. Thing B receives existence from thing C. Thing C receives its existence from thing D. On the surface, we might be inclined to think that such a chain could give us a complete explanation of the existence of things as long as it was infinitely long. But this is false, because even if we had an infinitely long chain of things passing existence onto each other, we would still not have an answer to how existence entered this system in the first place. The medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas distinguished two kinds of causal series: accidental and essentially ordered causal series. What makes these two kinds of series different is that in the first, a cause depends on its effect only to come to be, but not for its causal power. A line of descent from father to son to grandson is a classic example of this kind of causal series, since each member of the series has its own power to cause the next member of the series without the help of the previous members. Contrast this with an essentially ordered causal series, where each member of the series receives its existence from the previous member, but also only has the power to cause the next member of the series derived from the previous member. An example of this kind of series would be a train of boxcars, all being pulled by a train engine. One boxcar might be pulling another boxcar, but that first boxcar only has the power to pull the one behind it insofar as it is being pulled by the one in front of it. Each member of the series only has its power to make the series continue derived from the member in front of it. When we're talking about things having the ability to give essences existence, it's clear that we're talking about the second kind of causal series, essentially ordered causal series. After all, a thing only has the power to give another thing existence insofar as it exists, but anything with a distinction between its essence and its existence only exists when given existence by another, as stated earlier. Therefore, the chain of thing A getting existence from thing B, which gets existence from thing C, and so on, is an essentially ordered causal series. But what should be clear from the above description of an essentially ordered causal series is that such a series cannot go back to infinity. Ultimately, there must be something which has the power to cause the next member of the series not from another, but from its own nature, like the train engine in our earlier example. This brings us to our first conclusion. Conclusion 1. Therefore, there must be at least one thing which has no distinction between its essence and its existence. If having a distinction between essence and existence is what requires a thing to need an explanation for its existence outside of itself, then only something in which essence and existence are identical could have an explanation for its existence inside itself and terminate the causal series. Now let's see what this thing would have to look like. Premise 6. There could only ever be one such thing, one thing whose essence is its existence. If something's essence was the same as its existence, then its essence would just be existence. This means that this thing could not lack any existence. But as stated earlier, things are only different if there's some feature that one of them has that another one doesn't. But something which is existence itself can't lack any feature. Therefore, there could only be one thing whose essence is existence. Premise 7. This thing gives existence to everything which is not itself, either directly or indirectly. This follows from our last premise. If there's only one thing whose essence is existence, and everything whose essence is not existence must ultimately be supplied existence by something whose essence is existence, then it's ultimately the same one thing whose essence is existence, which gives existence to everything else that exists. Therefore, this thing is the cause of the existence of everything else which exists. Premise 8. This thing must be infinite. This follows necessarily on the notion of a being that can't lack any kind of existence, because to be infinite is to be without limits. So if a thing is finite, it lacks some kind of existence. Therefore, a being which doesn't lack any kind of existence is by definition infinite. Premise 9. This thing must be all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. The reason for this is that goodness, knowledge, and power are traditionally understood as ontologically interchangeable with the concept of being. In other words, as describing the concept of being using different language. This thesis is known as the doctrine of the transcendentals, and it is a bit controversial today, but I intend to do videos defending it in the future, so stay tuned for those. And assuming this thesis is true, it entails that anything whose essence is existence must be all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, since it can't lack any kind of existence. Premise 10. This thing must be unchanging. If change involves gaining or losing some kind of being, something which can't possibly lose or gain being can't change. Ergo, the being in question must be unchanging. Premise 11. This thing must be immaterial. Matter is intrinsically and inherently changeable. Therefore, nothing which is unchanging can be made up of matter. Premise 12. This thing must be timeless. Time is a measure of change. Therefore, anything which is incapable of change must be outside of time. Therefore, the being in question must be outside of time. Premise 13. This thing must be perfectly simple. Perfect simplicity refers to the characteristic of not having any component parts. Having component parts entails the ability to be broken down into those parts. Therefore, anything which is unchanging must be perfectly simple. Premise 14. God is a being whose essence is the same as his existence. This might not be the first thing we think of when we go about trying to define God, but it is actually how God defines himself. In the book of Exodus, God identifies himself as I am who am. In other words, as a being whose very nature and definition just is to be. The notion of God as the one thing which doesn't have a distinction between its essence and existence is a very biblical one. Premise 15. God is an infinite, all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful, unchanging, immaterial, timeless, perfectly simple being which gives existence to everything other than itself. This is just a list of some of the classical attributes of God as understood by the Judeo-Christian tradition. So this leads us to conclusion 2. Therefore, we have 2 reasons to conclude that the being which has no distinction between its essence and its existence is God. First, in virtue of just being a being whose essence is existence, we know this thing must be God because it matches the biblical understanding of God as a being who is what he is. And second, in virtue of being a being with all of the classical divine attributes, this being must be God. Conclusion 3. Therefore, God exists. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video enlightening, and God bless.